housing seems like it's registering as an issue on the campaign trail like I'd say no time I've seen.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone and everyone who believes that everyone should be well-housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're hosting the conversations you won't hear anywhere else about how to make housing more innovative and more attainable for everyone.
Part of my focus is on the fact that we need to build more housing in America.
I will also sign an executive order directing the immediate termination of every single unnecessary rule that is impeding housing construction and driving up the costs of housing.
We are just weeks away from the election, and so we didn't want to miss an opportunity to try to dissect what the candidates are saying on the campaign trail about what has turned out to be one of the biggest issues on the campaign trail, which is what is happening in housing.
That's right. We made the promise to pull back the curtain and try to get at what's real. What are the facts? What are the empty promises? So today we invited Jeb Mason, a partner at Mindset DC, a bipartisan public policy consultancy. Jeb is the perfect person for this conversation because he had a front row seat for the housing crisis back in 2008 when he served at the U.S. Treasury Department under Secretary Hank Paulson. And I know that informed a lot of what we're going to talk about because there are lasting results of that. And obviously what we really want to talk about is what's going on right now. What can you expect? And we're going to get into that with Jeb.
Thanks so much for being here, Jeb.
Yeah, awesome. Glad to be here, guys.
Awesome. So we've obviously got a lot to discuss about this upcoming election. We are a long ways away from the financial crisis that really got you into the world of housing. So let's just start by kind of talking about what each candidate's position is on housing, maybe disentangle what aspects are kind of really an executive branch action that they can take on their own, maybe what would require new legislation or funding. And let's start with the Harris camp.
And so we are going to cut red tape and work with the private sector to build 3 million new homes by the end of my first term.
She talks about tax incentives for single-family and multifamily construction, stopping Wall Street investors, rent controls and eliminating price gouging, cash incentives to spur local zoning innovation, and of course, the ever so popular $25,000 to anyone who decides to buy a first home.
It is part of my perspective that let's just do the work of giving first-time home buyers a $25,000 down payment assistance. Let them get their foot in the door.
Let's just get started with one of her kind of first promises, which a lot of these sort of blend to focus on, which is building 3 million homes by the end of her first term, which would be remarkable. Jeb, talk about how she's proposing to accomplish that with these various initiatives she's talked about, and do you think that's realistic?
You're right. I mean, housing seems like it's registering as an issue on the campaign trail like I'd say no time I've seen since at least the global financial crisis, which of course had a lot of its roots in housing and the subprime bubble. I think I saw a poll somewhere along the way in the last 6 months that suggested the majority of Americans would welcome a recession even if it meant relief on housing prices, which I think is really remarkable. It's perhaps not surprising that neither candidate is really talking about a deliberate reversal of sort of the monetary and fiscal stimulus that I would argue got us into and exacerbated this housing affordability crisis. It's perhaps part and parcel with a sort of more populist campaign and the more populist drift of both parties that, their answers are something else. And in the Harris case, I think it is a mix of, both demand side stimulus and supply side stimulus, let's say, along with I think, very responsible recognition that, a lot of the impediments to building new homes comes at the local and state level, but especially the local level. And so there is a nod to working deliberately with state and local governments to reduce barriers to development if we're going to actually meet the demand shortage that we have out there for housing.
Yeah, and that's this $40 billion fund. Like just to be clear, how she's proposing to change state and local feelings on housing is sort of to provide a carrot, if you will.
Yeah, provide a carrot, and I think it's not explicitly mentioned. I think in her campaign materials, but it's not inconceivable you could mix carrots and sticks together. But I think it's probably deliberate that they're taking more of a carrot approach at tying federal support, for localities who want to break down barriers and invite more high density development, for instance. And others have proposed adding sticks to that mix, and that you could tie existing housing funding streams, not just new money, to at least localities reporting on what they're doing to enhance density and reform zoning rules.
Can you talk a little bit about density as you just brought it up? Because it seems to be we always end up in the same cycle where we can't decide if we want to build single family homes or higher density. And then the higher density triggers the not in my backyard versus yes in my backyard. And we throw up our hands and we walk away to the next cycle.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of embedded in the name, NIMBYism, right? I mean, I think a lot of people are for higher density in theory, and then have second thoughts when it comes to their own neighborhoods, and it's not just, I think, the perception that you're building higher density. It's the perception that, in some communities that with a higher degree of rentership comes more transience and less sort of, commitment or integration with the community long term. There's probably some legitimacy to those concerns, right? But I'm encouraged that I think both sides of the political spectrum seem to recognize now that this is an issue. And, I'm also encouraged that we probably have better data than we've ever had before. I'm a big believer in, empirical policymaking. And so I think tapping into data that's provided, some of which is private, some of which is public, but it's going to be a case by case analysis, right? I mean, there's not one housing market in the United States. There's thousands. And I think what often happens is people kind of shrug their shoulders and decide that this is not a federal issue. But, the president, whomever it might be after November, has a lot of convening power and has the power of the microphone, as I watch you guys also lever the power of the microphone. So, it takes leadership, and somebody's going to have to step up. And it's not just one thing. There's no silver bullet. I mean, zoning reform is not going to solve this challenge. I mean, right. And so I think what also requires, and I would say, I'm encouraged by aspects of what the Harris campaign has proposed in terms of they seem to really recognize that you've got to boost supply and that you can't just push on the demand side. That's a mistake. And so I think there's actually been a healthy recognition during the Biden years, and there's some healthy recognition evident in the Harris plan that they know you've got to solve the supply problem before you go pushing too hard on the demand side. That said, I think political leaders who have to get elected are going to be tempted towards the demand stuff because there are more levers and dials at the federal level to that, and that's something to watch. I think there's also a little bit of a disconnect in some of the Harris plan in the sense that part and parcel with this sort of rising populism on the right and the left, there's, seems to be a heavy dose of criticism of private capital. Well, you're not going to solve the housing supply problem without attracting private capital. That's got to be the name of the game. What's the message to those who have capital that are ready and willing to deploy it in support of building new supply and putting new sticks in the ground? Is it, hey, we want you to be part of the solution, or is it, we want you to be a part of the solution until we don't, and then we're going to criticize you ad nauseum for being rapacious capitalists? I think some balance is would be welcomed, and I don't think that's probably unique to the Harris camp. So I don't want that to sound like a partisan comment.
No, I think that's the right question, because one of the things that's been confounding to me has been when you think of traditional supply and demand, we've never had more demand. And to your point, now we're putting more and more programs into demand. And yet the supply side is constrained, restrained around the type of housing in the places we need it. So I do think this is an area where it's frozen in some sort of tension that either the bully pulpit or the carrot or the stick do have to be leveraged, because we have seen unprecedented demand, and yet supply, those builders haven't really responded in the places we want or need them to, in the ways we want or need them to. And that's remained true now for a while.
Yeah. In the Harris camp, though, I mean, Jeb, you made the point you need the private market to get involved, and I think she recognizes that. I will say that certainly government spending is the thing that's common between both platforms. There's just more money being spent, and $40 billion going to zoning reform, $25,000 first-time homebuyer credit. We all know that's never going to happen, but still, even as a proposal, certainly pushes on the demand side too much. But I think in terms of engaging the private market, the proposals that I see, well, the one that pushes against the private market is obviously rent caps and rent limitations, and against rent, price gouging or whatnot. And who knows how that gets implemented? And that certainly is unfriendly if you're a multifamily private builder or developer. But the favorable thing seems to happen on the tax side, which is an expansion of LIHTC and potentially an application of a LIHTC-like structure for single family home developers. If you were to build a home that gets sold to a low to moderate income buyer, you won't have to pay taxes on the development costs or whatever that might be. Again, curious to get your thoughts on that sort of tax side incentive on construction. And I guess that really just leads to the battle royale of taxes that's coming up, and God knows what's happening there. But anyway, what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, look, I think a big part of what you can do at a federal level and from a federal policy standpoint to influence the supply side will come probably through the tax code. You already mentioned LIHTC or a LIHTC-like structure for the single family side. The other thing that we have going on next year that you alluded to is some people, the tax nerds in Washington are calling the Super Bowl of taxes. I mean, there is a, once a decade or so certainty that we will have a major tax bill next year, no matter who is president and no matter who wins either chamber of Congress. There will be a vehicle and there will be an automatic discussion around the various tax policies. From a housing stakeholder standpoint, there'll be some defense as well as some offense. And I think if Harris were elected, her proposal for a first-time homebuyer, down payment assistance, would be part of that. You could also see other things work their way into that equation, including various other tax incentives for home builders. There are a variety of different ideas percolating Capitol Hill right now around that. There'll be some defense too. I mean, there'll be questions around the personal exemption, the mortgage interest deduction, mortgage insurance deductibility, which is expired. Housing will be I think a major feature in that tax bill for sure.
So one of the things that I kind of want to zoom out a little bit as we start to think about the Trump side and the other side of this race as well. Let's pause for a second where there's overlap. You mentioned earlier housing taking center stage. So it seems like this concept of the American dream is home ownership, and home ownership, individual home ownership, is the American dream. Could we say, bipartisan at this point for this campaign?
I think there is agreement that still, like, the idea of homeownership as sort of quintessential part of the American dream still exists. But, a significant dent was put in that idea with the global financial crisis. And so I think for the most part, I've been pleasantly, wouldn't quite say surprised, but been very glad that most the sort of policy influencers and policy makers, I think, that really talk about housing policy since the global financial crisis have largely held to the idea that it needs to be sustainable, that you need proper underwriting, that you need to exclude certain product features that tend to set people up to go bust and that ultimately lead to disastrous outcomes for the economy. The other big, wouldn't necessarily call it fly in the ointment, but I mean a challenge for housing policy as well as all policy, candidly, is the fiscal situation in the United States. And, we've now reached what some would call a major tipping point, perhaps, in that we're paying, more at the federal level in interest payments than we are for national defense. The cost of all of this, whether that's cost in terms of various tax incentives, whether those are tax deductions, tax credits, refundable tax credits, which is essentially spending through the tax code, as well as any new spending, I think is going to, in the term of the next president, is going to run into a certain fiscal reality that it seems like we've been ignoring now for, frankly, a couple decades.
You're running for the chance to get blamed. That's what you just said. We're running for the chance to get blamed for whatever happens next.
It's a bit of a hot potato. Can you continue the status quo for 4 more years without having a major fiscal crisis?
Disaster.
I don't know if you can.
I mean, status quo would be ideal. I mean, at this point, I think the rough increase to the deficit from the two candidates is between $3 and $8 trillion. I don't know what we're choosing between, really, but I think spending is the one thing that we can say both parties definitely agree on. Well, pivoting to the Trump campaign, there's kind of really two sources to look at. I mean, outside of what you sort of hear them say on the campaign trail, you've got what he's published on his policy positions on the Trump website, which really focuses on four things: reducing rates, opening up federal lands, tax incentives of some kind, and cutting regulations, I think is what you'd sort of find, at least in print there. There have been a couple of other things that have come up. One that's obviously notable is J.D. Vance saying during the vice presidential debate that immigration is the driving problem of housing and that mass deportation in some ways is the solution to that. But anyway, what am I missing on the Trump side? Which of those do you think is most top of mind? Are there things that aren't being articulated that a Trump candidacy really is about?
Well, look, I mean, we know that immigration is a marquee issue for the Trump candidacy. It probably does more to animate, why he is still, in my view, and why he is still in contention to be president a second time. So I think, there's a substantial portion of the country who, feels like there is an immigration problem that needs to be addressed. And there's also a large contingent that is very uncomfortable with the demagoguery around immigration for a bunch of reasons. In fairness to the Trump camp, I mean, we have added roughly the population of Arizona to the country in the last 4 years. I mean, that's going to have an effect, of course, on housing prices. It's going to be, local markets more than it is maybe national, but that's not a trivial demand surge. But there are a lot of the things that drove that demand too, right? And we talked about excessive, in my view, fiscal and monetary stimulus as well, that some of which was understandable in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. But there was, it was obvious enough, in my view, by mid 2021 that we may have overshot, and it was time to dial it back.
My plan will rapidly defeat inflation, quickly bring down prices, and reignite explosive economic growth.
He's spoken at the Economic Club of New York back on September 5th and delivered what was probably maybe his most obvious economic speech, let's say, talked about the importance of taming inflation. Now, I don't know that can completely be squared with his positions on fiscal policy and trade policy, candidly. But at least, there's a recognition that inflation impacts affordability, and we probably need to get it back under control.
And we will open up portions of federal land for large-scale housing construction. These zones will be ultra-low tax and ultra-low regulation.
It seems a little bit fanciful just because you got to build housing where the jobs are and where people want to live. And in every case, that's not going to be a solution. But it's, it's an interesting think tanky like idea to consider whether it could work in certain circumstances.
I mean, the opening up federal lands one is interesting. And it actually seemed that at some point that was a bipartisan sort of thinking, which is if the federal government owns land and we need land to build, why don't we use that land? I mean, of course, yes, you do need jobs there. But I think Trump very early on said something about building 20 new freedom cities. I hadn't heard that level of detail that you just shared, Jeb. So that's kind of interesting, this idea of creating new zones. And obviously, I hope they happen in Ohio and or Michigan. But in any case, the other topic, and I fucking hate bringing this one up, but obviously it's been a part of what the Trump campaign, not the campaign itself, but has been talked about with regards to a Trump administration is GSE privatization. Can you spare us having this conversation? Tell us it's just not going to happen, or do we have to actually think about some boring conversations about privatizing?
What do you mean boring? I think that I'm a little bit of a GSE reform geek, or at least have that reputation, rightly or wrongly. Look, I've believed for some time, the next time we have a Republican president, and certainly if that Republican president is Trump, that we will be talking about GSE reform in a major way. And I recognize and feel how much, I would say, fatigue there is, GSE reform fatigue there is after, for a long time, it was seen as the great unfinished work of the post-global financial crisis, regulatory response. I think it's still seen that way by some people. There was a couple of really honest, runs made at doing sort of comprehensive housing finance reform back in the 2014, and maybe an attempt to restart that around 2016. But I think ultimately policymakers on both sides of the aisle concluded that there's very little political upside to talking further about GSE reform, and that it's difficult to have a conversation around GSE reform where you don't end up in like a constant negotiation between various interests over, because the GSEs have such influence over, the housing market, which is the fifth of the economy, I'd say. So it's understandable that there's fatigue, but but I think the Trump team will come in with a view that, first of all, they're, post Collins, the case where the Supreme Court decided that the structure of the FHFA, which is the overseer for Fannie and Freddie, is unconstitutional unless the director can be removed without cause, and which was the remedy they proposed or imposed, I should say. In that case, now the Trump team, unlike the first Trump term, has the chance to replace FHFA director, early in their term, if not day one. I think it'll be in the first few months. That's not necessarily a commentary on the job Sandra's been doing, which I think has been pretty solid for the most part. But there is a undoubtable perception shift that's happened within the Republican Party, I think, which I think is understandable, that in a post-Collins environment, and also because of the release of certain things like the equitable housing finance plans, that from their perspective, it sure appears as though FHFA has, under the Biden administration, adopted at least the rhetoric and some of the policy priorities of a Democratic administration. And so from a Republican perspective, this feels like, we're on the verge of a permanent nationalization where you leave these two behemoth financial institutions to become like the permanent playthings of progressive administrations in the future. And so, whereas I think a lot of Republicans on GSE reform back in, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, had pretty particular views in some cases about exactly what the structure of the market ought to look like post-conservatorship. I think the shift has happened where most Republicans feel like it's just time to get them out. And other considerations are secondary to that consideration. So I do think Trump administration will make it a priority. I think in nominating someone to FHFA, that person will likely sit before a Senate Banking Committee and say that their statutory obligation is to get them out under existing law, that it's the intention of the administration to get them out. And so we will, fatigue or not, the stakeholder community broadly is going to be thrust back into a pretty fulsome GSE reform discussion. So I've been encouraging clients to, dust off old plans and be sharpening thoughts about, what an ideal outcome looks like from a legislative standpoint, but also recognize that there's a very good chance you're not doing legislation, that it will be done administratively. And so I think it merits more deep thought than maybe it's had to date within the stakeholder community about what an administrative path to exit looks like. Because whether the administration can get it done or not is probably a separate question. There's a lot of steps that would need to be undertaken. It's not as simple as some people like to think, but I think it can be done administratively if there's sufficient will in the administration. And if there's an administration that seems likely to exhibit that will, it's probably a Trump one. So.
And I'm going to annoy the shit out of John and just ask another question. I'm taking the bait on this one just for one more. I'll put my libertarian hat on. I'll ask you, Jeb, to put on your independent mortgage company executive, your CEO level hat. As we think about the cost of housing and cost of financing housing, which we just talked about, and I just don't see how ending conservatorship doesn't leave particularly mortgage companies and the cost of a mortgage as going way up. Am I misguided in that thinking that a privatized and end of conservatorship, a privatized Fannie and Freddie isn't bad news for independent mortgage companies and the sales aspect of the home loans that they're pushing all day, every day?
It's a great question. I don't think it's inevitably negative if you consider that, but it does get to why we probably haven't seen GSE reform yet, right? Which is that you probably need to have an FHFA director that is willing to shake up the status quo enough that you hit some pain points for people in the industry and in this broader stakeholder community. Under statute, they are supposed to be pricing the guarantee that the GSEs provide as though they're private market institutions. FHFA indicated it wanted to have a more fulsome debate around that this year after it undertook a comprehensive pricing review, because there are more nuances than this, but to super simplify a very complicated topic that led to a lot of confusion on Capitol Hill and elsewhere and in the press. There are two big drivers of what the pricing of the GSEs looks like. One is the enterprise regulatory capital framework the RCF, as we call it in Washington, which was finalized under Calabria in the previous Trump administration, and then tweaked slightly by Sandra Thompson, but not that materially in my view. And then there is what kind of return on equity should the GSEs be targeting? I think that's a really interesting question because it gets to the heart of, well, what are these entities, what would they look like post-conservatorship? And there's a million different versions of that, but in the highly stylized world, there's kind of two. One is, do you want multiple guarantors in a competitive marketplace, hopefully with mechanisms in place that you can afford to let someone that takes excessive risk fail, which is an open question still when it comes to GSEs, and in which case you probably need, ROEs that are not dissimilar from what you need for GSIBs, something like low to mid double digits, right? Whereas, and then I think you'll see a lot of talk around a potential utility model. And I would argue that almost every permutation of GSE reform I've seen is a utility model of some sort. And so there's some clarity around terms that'll be needed. But I think what some people mean is a regulated rate of return type utility, whereby, you might have a lower ROE threshold, and that would feed through to pricing. But Jeremy, I don't know that the pricing is as differential as some people think, and so that is the pricing from where they're pricing today and what it would have to be, post-conservatorship. There are other wrinkles to this, of course. There's like, what's the nature and extent of the government guarantee going forward? And is there an explicit guarantee that only Congress could create that's full faith and credit and wraps the MBS, as a lot of reform plans suggest? Or is there something like a continuance of the current PSPAs, the preferred stock purchase agreements, or what we used to call the keep well agreements, in place between Treasury Department and each GSE to back them, which is explicit to a cap, a nominal cap that can't be increased from now? Or do you just go back to a world like I think former Director Calabria suggested you could potentially do, where, I think a lot of people would say, some people would say there's no guarantee. Others would say, well, that's the recipe to have an implicit guarantee, because the presumption will still be that the GSEs remain too big to fail and that the government would have to ride to the rescue in a crisis. So anyway,
I'll go down the rabbit hole with you for just 1 second and just editorialize on this topic, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about, which is the reason the debate is tiresome is because there's no fucking new ideas that are being bounced around, right? I mean, it's how do we continue using them as a piggy bank in case one? In case two, how do we take two large private, not really private acting, government guaranteed behemoth of organizations that have no competitors and shove them into a private market? And while we think about doing that, prohibit them from being able to innovate in any possible way, and then think that something good is going to happen, that when you're just kind of shaking up the world, right? Versus, something that might be more creative, like, why don't we invite competition, which is the thing that does drive down price or increase things like innovative ways of measuring income and the like. So, until I see somebody actually bring up an idea that feels a little bit different than the same tired, approaches that we've heard about, it does. And Jeb, you mentioned the capital regime. It's, you're taking a capital regime that looks like banking capital regime and then going to make it so tough and difficult to be in that kind of market. Who's going to want to compete? You got these two behemoths. Sorry, I'm getting on my soapbox a little bit here. It probably means it's a good time for us to take a quick break and come back and maybe talk about a couple of the maybe practical implications of the election and maybe what some of the lenders, innovators, and others should be thinking about. This episode is brought to you by Bilt Rewards. Bilt is a rewards program, just like an airline program that is centered around your home and neighborhood. But instead of earning miles for flying, Bilt rewards you for paying rent, no matter how you pay. As a member, you can earn points at over 20,000 local restaurants, local merchants, and those points are now the most valuable rewards currency. You can use it to book travel, on Amazon, or even towards a down payment.
Bilt is revolutionizing housing. If you want to learn more, email John at lawless@biltrewards.com. Welcome back. Jeb, we have a few more minutes with you, and we wanted to ask some questions about what you wish we would talk about or what you believe could actually work that maybe we haven't. And I'll lead the witness just a bit. In talking to some folks at HUD, there was a sense that factory-built housing might be, manufactured housing, might be an area of bipartisan support, that's a common ground, so to speak, in housing. I'll start there just because that's a topic near and dear to my heart, but I'll let you answer in whatever other topics we haven't touched on. What is some common ground, or what is possible in terms of bipartisan support and practical support going forward?
Yeah, it's a great flag, Jeremy. I think if you want to build a lot of houses and you want to do it reasonably quickly, I think factory built housing's got to be a part of the solution. And I'm, like you, kind of gratified that it seems like there is an increasing bipartisan awareness of that. There are a lot of different innovative models out there. Of course, there's the manufactured housing model, and there are adjustments that are being made, have been made, are being made, and could still be made probably to allow manufactured housing to produce more than they're producing now. I think manufactured housing is probably producing 100,000 plus units a year run rate, and that could increase. And I think HUD has shown a willingness to work with them on refining the HUD code, which governs the building code for manufactured housing, to allow for some wider latitude when it comes to designs. These are not like your grandparents' mobile homes anymore, right? And there's some really attractive designs out there. Some people are doing entire manufactured communities. And so, and I'm pretty encouraged that there are policymakers on both sides that, once they've sort of taken a second to look at it, recognize that, okay, there's an opportunity there that's true, not just necessarily in rural areas, but certainly in the rural areas. It makes a huge impact. People get it, but I think even in suburban and maybe some urban environments, it makes sense. And then, of course, there's modular housing of a variety of other stripes too that aren't necessarily subject to the HUD national code for manufactured housing, but can make a big difference. I mean, you've seen people that are basically 3D printing houses now. So it's fascinating, the pace of innovation. There again, I think you've got probably an alphabet soup of regulations that you got to jump through at the local level. Often you need localities that want the supply, that are willing to roll up their sleeves and sort of work with the producers, I think, to figure out how to attract that supply. And you're going to need private capital behind these ideas, right? So you need, I think, not just at the local level, but it doesn't hurt to have at a federal level, some support for the idea of, it doesn't have to just be traditional multifamily or traditional site-built, housing. There are a lot of other models that have emerged, and where, with a little bit of wind at their back, could increase production really substantially.
That's optimistic, and I kind of agree. And certainly there have been legislative moves to sort of remove chassis requirements. I think some of those things are really great, and with some support, hopefully can go through. Pivoting to something else, which the big topic, obviously, as you mentioned, is immigration. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on. You said that in the last 3 years, I think you said we've had increased the population by the state of Arizona, which sounds very much like a campaign talking point, which is a very, very well framed one. But look, I mean, 5 million new immigrants in the last 3 years. Even if you assume 5 to a household, that's 1 million homes, which is a significant percentage of the 3.5 million missing homes. But on the flip side, and the counter argument I've probably seen most common to the criticism of Vance's comment on immigration, the debate is really, that's our source of population growth, period. So if nobody's having any babies and population is shrinking, we better be importing people. Otherwise, we're going to have a shrinking economy. But putting that one aside, is that about 20 to 40% of the labor force, or the construction labor force, comes from immigration. The idea of a mass deportation program could really be a shot in the foot in terms of building new homes if you eliminate an important, source of labor. So I'm just kind of curious, is there any hope to reconcile these two things? And is there any recognition, particularly on the Republican side, of the importance of immigration on manufacturing? Or, I guess as I'm saying that, it just sounds so stupid, but maybe you can respond to that. Is there any chance that immigrants could have a pathway to citizenship through building homes here?
You're trying to get me in trouble. So
honestly,
I think,
I'm rambling, honestly.
Here's maybe how I think about it. I mean, I was working in the Bush White House back in 2005 when, the last, I think, real big push was made on comprehensive immigration reform. I would say that it's almost impossible to find a Republican today that thinks the kind of balance that I think President Bush was trying to strike between, frankly, the economic case as well as the humanitarian case for immigration needs to be balanced, of course, with having appropriate controls on the border and understanding who's coming in the country, a legal employment regime, as well as potentially a path to citizenship. I think everyone's noticed that the party has shifted quite a bit there. But I think if you want to strike a more optimistic tone, I don't think that those elements have gone away, and sort of recognizing, I mean, look, in the real estate space, Donald Trump's a real estate developer. What do they say? Land, lumber, and labor, right? So are the major inputs to new housing construction. So I'm sure that's not lost on him. But, I think what's happened, I think the way I would say, if put it more charitably, is like people have inverted the priorities, right? Which is that the perception, I think, in the public, or a very substantial portion of the public, is that the border is so out of control that you got to get that untamed first. And then we can talk about paths to, legal employment. We can talk about what kind of priorities you put on what kinds of immigration. I think despite the caricature that Trump invites of himself on immigration, no one's talking about a zero immigration world, right? And here's an optimistic tone. And I wish there was media that was this responsible. Why not ask the two candidates two simple questions? And maybe I'm just way too simple-minded here, but ask both of them how many legal immigrants you should have a year. And if you really forced them to come up with a number, I bet it wouldn't be that far off. And if you ask them a second follow-up, how many illegal immigrants should you have every year? I bet if they were forced to answer, they'd answer pretty close to the same, which, in the first one, it's probably something like 1 million a year. And the second one, it's probably close to zero, if they're honest. And so why can't we start with, where the concentric circles overlap and try to develop sensible, empirically based policy that respects the law, that respects human dignity, that respects the needs of the economy? Your guess is as good as mine, but I'm going to try to remain optimistic.
That's like a mic drop moment there, Jeb. That was well stated. I thought it was really, really good. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today, Jeb. This has been a great overview of the election and what the two candidates are saying, as well as, I think, a relatively optimistic tone. I don't know about you, John, but I ended with a lot of sense of where we are and a lot of sense of where we're going. There is a path here to housing innovation. There's a path to jobs that create houses, and there's a path to an ownership economy that does actually drive the economic productivity that we need, that gets us out of some of this mess. And so I know that's hard. I know that's more than just the president's job, but I think you've framed it up in a way that should be easy for our listeners to understand.
Hope so. Hey, love what you're doing. Thanks for having me on. My old boss, Hank Paulson, used to say this all the time. It's like being in a family. If you think about policy a lot, you become highly cognizant of all the challenges. And there are some really substantial challenges facing the country right now. But I'd still rather have our challenges than anybody else's in the world. We also have an unbelievably, I think, a deep commitment among the public still to the rule of law, to basic human rights and freedom. And I think that's a good basis on which to try to formulate policy going forward, and a reason to still be optimistic, even when things look dark, that as I think Churchill said, I'm going to misquote him here, the American people always do the right thing after they've tried everything else.
Oh, this has been a very warm and fuzzy end to the show. I know our listeners don't need any encouragement to vote, but I also echo the sentiment that the election is really not an end. It's a beginning. There's so many things that will happen after a new administration's in place. Not to mention the exciting, I like the Super Bowl framing of the tax debate next year. Makes it sound so much more enjoyable. But a lot to be done once we know the outcome of the election. So that does it for this episode. We would love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com if you're interested. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review at any of the various feeds that you have.
Hit subscribe and follow us on all your feeds so you get the next episode of Housing Insiders.